Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Douglas Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer for State and the Chair. We'll start out with Gianna Petito will be taking us through the budget process. Then Nick Kramer will go into the operating statement, a little bit more detail on the numbers. Then Emily will review the draft clean water budget recommendation. And then we have time to discuss and adopt the budget to post, the draft budget to post for public comment. For that, we'll have 10 minutes for public comment and preview our communications plan with Colleen around how we're going to manage and respond to public comment in the process. And then we'll move into our wrap up and talk about next steps. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today. I think, Emily, now we could move into a more formal introduction of Jean.
Yep, that sounds great. Yes, would you like me to kick that off, Doug?
Yeah, if you could. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome, Jean Voorhees, as the newest public member of the Clean Water Board. We are thrilled to have Jean joining. Jean brings with us quite a bit of expertise in the water quality space, having had a career with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency out of Region 1 for New England, and is located out of Southern Vermont. And we are just thrilled to have Jean joining the team. Jean, would you like to say hello or share anything else about your background with the group?
No, I'm really happy to be here, and I have retired from EPA, and so this is I see this as a way of getting back and being involved, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Jean.
Sure.
Doug, do you think we have time to do a quick round of introducing all the board members?
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Great.
Yeah.
How about we start in the conference room and then we can run through the folks on Teams.
Okay, so I'm Jim Giffen. I live on the lake in Colchester. I've been a board member. I think this is my second term. And retired state employee for over 30 years, primarily in the Agency of Human Services and the financial sector.
Thank you, Jim.
Right. And again, I'm Douglas Farnham. I'm the chair, but I began involved with the board when it was created in my role at the tax department as policy director and economist, and then came into a more formal role when I moved over to the Agency of Administration in 2020 after the pandemic. So I've been the Agency of Administration's designee as the chair for approximately 4 years at this point.
All right. How about we head over to Bob?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Bob Flint. I'm in Springfield. I'm the Executive Director of Springfield Regional Development Corporation, the RDC for Southern Windsor County, and beginning my second term as a public member of this board.
Thanks, Bob.
Yep.
Chad.
Good morning, Chad Tyler. Our family business sits on Missisquoi Bay, and it has since 1933. I'm in my second term as a board member as well. And Jean, we public members have a private pact that the four of us can get together at any time if we have any questions.
Great.
All right, so those are the four public board members. So now we'll move over to the secretaries on the board. We'll start with Secretary Tebbetts.
Good morning, all. Anson Tebbetts, Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Markets, coming to you from 116 Sage Street. Good to see you all.
Good to see you. Deputy Secretary Brooks.
Good morning, all. So the Agency of Commerce through Secretary Curley has a spot on the board. I serve as her designee, and this is my third year on the board.
Thank you. Secretary Flynn?
Good morning, everybody. Joe Flynn, Secretary of the Agency of Transportation.
Thank you. And Secretary Moore?
Morning, everyone, and good morning, Jean. It's nice to see you again. Julie Moore, Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources.
Thank you. Great. So that covers the introduction of our Clean Water Board, kicking off another budget cycle. Back to you, Doug, for the consent agenda.
Just reminding all the board members, our consent agenda for today includes the February 14th, 2024 meeting minutes and the February 2024 Clean Water Fund operating statement. No action required, but just for awareness. So I think now we're ready to move on to the next section for Gianna.
Great. Thank you, Chair Farnham. Hi, everyone. My name is Gianna Petito. I'm here to give a brief overview of the budget process. Not much has changed, so if you are generally familiar with the budget process, this will seem familiar to you, and this is maybe helpful for folks who are new. So this can be found on page 24 of the full meeting materials packet. And this is sort of a timeline that starts on the top left and works its way zigzaggedy all the way down. The squares on this slide are color coded, and that coloring indicates an action of a certain board or entity. So just for orientation, the yellow indicates an action of the Vermont Emergency Board. The gray indicates actions of agencies. The green indicates actions of the Clean Water Board. And the blue indicates actions of the legislature. So we start up on the top left in late July, and the Vermont Emergency Board meets twice a year, late July and usually late January. And the late July meeting kicks off our budgeting process, in which the Vermont Emergency Board adopts a consensus revenue forecast for the fiscal year that we're building a budget for. So we're building a budget for the state fiscal year 2026. State fiscal year 2026 will begin next July 2025 and run through June 2026. So after the consensus revenue forecast is adopted, our friends at the Agency of Administration help us update the Clean Water Fund operating statement for what the projected revenue will be for state fiscal year 2026 in the Clean Water Fund. And that establishes our budget targets for the Clean Water Fund. We'll talk more about that later today. Then there's some internal interagency coordination in preparing a draft budget for today's board consideration that happens through from July through September. And then here we are at the first green box, October 11th. Congratulations, the launch of the state fiscal year 2026 budgeting process. And so here the main intent is for the board to consider the draft, discuss the draft, and approve materials to open up for public comment. This year, the public comment period will be October 18th through November 17th, and the public hearing is scheduled for November 8th, and this is where the board will be available to hear directly from the public any questions, comments, or concerns about the draft budget. After the public comment period closes, there'll be some time for the staff to support the board in reviewing and summarizing the public comments. And then in December, when the board reconvenes, they'll consider all the public comment, see if there's any changes that should be made to the budget recommendation, and then transmit that recommendation over to the Agency of Administration. To support that recommendation, internally, all the agencies update their Clean Water Fund and capital bill budget language if needed as part of the full packet that's submitted to the Agency of Administration. And then the governor packages all of that and proposes a full budget to the legislature in early January. And then January through April, sometimes May, sometimes June, the legislature reviews the full budget request, which includes, speckled throughout it, the Clean Water Board's recommendation across certain line items. In the meantime, the Emergency Board re-meets, updates consensus revenue forecasts, both for state fiscal year 26, but also the current fiscal year 25 and the future fiscal year 27. And so that information gets integrated into an updated Clean Water Fund operating statement by our friends at the Agency of Administration. And then the board typically reconvenes in February to review the updated operating statement, see if any changes need to be made, and also do other business. By May or June, the legislature hopefully authorizes the budget. And then by the following July, when the state fiscal year starts, state agencies can have received the spending authority to start to implement the budget. The next slide down is just a zoom in of the interagency coordination that has happened up to date to prepare this draft budget, should you be interested. Thanks.
Thank you, Gianna.
One thing to add there, Emily and Gianna, the process flow is as shown. However, the emergency board in times of uncertainty or with revenue updates, like they generally have those 2 meetings every year, but they sometimes have to call special sessions if there seems to be reason to update the revenue. And then so that will shove another yellow block into that process wherever it happens. And then the board will have to choose whether or not to react to that. So that is the general process as it flows, but we have had once or twice where the revenue conditions were volatile enough that the emergency board chose to meet, and then we have to evaluate as a board the impact on our budget process.
Thank you. Oops, sorry about that. All right. Next up, we have Nicholas Kramer sharing an overview of the Clean Water Fund operating statement. Thank you, Nick.
All right, thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. Nick Kramer from the Agency of Administration. We're right across the hall from Doug. Good to see you all again. Welcome, Jean, to the board. I know we have a pretty packed agenda, so as always, I will try to balance thoroughness and speed here in working through what is a fairly detailed document. But so yeah, as Gianna mentioned, this is the operating statement for the Clean Water Fund. I think it might be helpful to start with a quick refresher for all of us and anybody who may be new to the process. As Gianna indicated, right, and I think as is evident looking at that process flow document on the previous slide, that's the whole process for a fiscal year, right? And then based on the timing of which budget we are preparing, we are often looking at revenue estimates that are several years ahead. So like she mentioned, we're working on FY26. FY26, of course, is the fiscal year that starts July 1st, 2025, almost a year from now, and won't end until June 30th, 2026, which is a very long time for now, especially with regards to revenues, right, and revenue changes. So this iterative budgeting process that we go through is kind of the best tool we have to keep up with what is a constantly difficult to predict and changing revenue environment. But I think it's important to set that caveat at the outset, right, that the farther we get out in time, the less predictable these numbers are. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, certainly since I've been involved with this process, is that it's very difficult to predict where the revenues are going to go, right? And especially as we have come out of the pandemic and all of the federal stimulus that has had kind of trickle out effects on the economy writ large. I think it's fair to say, with a couple small exceptions, that the general theme has been each time we get more information, each time the e-board meets and the economists come together with a consensus revenue forecast, very often what we have seen are upgrades to the forecast, so more optimistic projections than the last time we met. And I think that's been both great in a lot of ways because, of course, who doesn't want more money? It's also a challenge from a budgeting process, right? If you're kind of constantly, you're planning a budget of a certain size and then more money keeps coming in, especially if you're planning way in advance and there's this legislative process to navigate, it can be challenging, right? So I just setting that table and I'll dive into what we are actually looking at. I don't know, Gianna, if it's you controlling, if you're able to scroll down just a little bit so we can see. Yeah, perfect. Well, maybe back up just a bit so we don't lose the section titles. Great. I'm just going to be referring to the colors, I think, at the top. Great. So yeah, good enough. If it's small for anybody, we can zoom in. But so I'm going to start with the green columns. You'll notice there are three, one for FY24, one for FY25, and one for FY26. So those columns represent the information that we had the last time this board met, which would have been in January of 2024. So a refresher or a reminder, the plan at that point was, so I'm starting in the upper left-hand corner of the chart. This gives the three primary revenue streams to the Clean Water Fund. There is a surcharge on the property transfer tax. The sheets is for abandoned bottle deposits. So when you go buy a bottle and don't return it, eventually that money trickles its way back to the state. No pun intended for clean water work. And then the meals and rooms tax, a 6% portion of all meals and rooms tax collected is diverted to the Clean Water Fund. And together, those three sources make up the bulk of the revenue. There is a small reversions item in January in 2024, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and also interest. But generally, those are the three pieces we look at. As of last January, we were predicting overall revenues in 2024 of about 25.5 million. That's on line G. And then as part of a process to a multi-year effort to spend down what had been kind of an accumulated, unobligated reserve based on those surpluses coming in, we had more money kind of falling to the bottom line. You'll see the FY24 budget actually reflected more expenditures than current year revenues, right? So we're predicting $25.5 million coming in. We were actually spending, if you look on line X, the subtotal of all appropriations, including base appropriations and so-called one-time appropriations, was 21.8. But then because this is an operating statement before the Clean Water Fund, and technically the agricultural elements of the Clean Water budget, those flow to a different fund, the Ag Water Quality Fund. Here they show as transfers out of the fund, and they're not lumped in with the appropriations. So to get a full picture of spending, you really have to add that subtotal on line X with the subtotal on line AD, which is all transfers. So when you add 21.8 with 8.8, you get a much higher total, well, a somewhat higher total than the 25.5 in revenue. And for a projected, at that time, $5 million, I hesitate to call it a deficit, right? But spending in excess of current year revenue. The reason we were planning to do that is because we had 13.4 million on the bottom line from prior years. That's on line AG. So if you subtract 5 from 13, you get roughly 8.4 million. That was the plan as of January. Since then, we have closed FY24. So I'm moving over to the white column. We have actual results in terms of revenue from FY24. Those were higher than projected. So you can see the clean water surcharge is up. The sheets are about where we anticipated, and the meals and rooms tax is slightly up. The interest income booked is a big piece of the overage. This is a relatively new trend in terms of the Clean Water Fund in recent years. If you go back a couple fiscal years, annual interest income was only like $100,000 or less. What has happened basically is as the Clean Water Fund has grown, and they're based on a cash flow of we make appropriations, revenue comes in, appropriations are made, agencies are granted spending authority, and then they go out and spend money. In that interim period, that money is sitting in the state's coffers and earning interest, which, as we all know, interest rates have been very high in recent years. So the combination of a pretty significant fund balance and those cash flow timings have led to significant interest income booked, which helps put us above target. So instead of 25.5, we booked 28.9, almost $29 million. You can see, skipping through the details, basically that shakes out to, instead of ending the year with, we were anticipating an $8.4 million unallocated surplus, that jumps up $3 and change million up to 11.8. So now I'm jumping over to the green column, the next one over. This was the plan for FY25 and the FY25 recommended budget. Again, we were anticipating 8.4 at the bottom on the bottom line at the end of FY24. We were anticipating 25.5 roughly in current year revenue. We were doing a similar thing with base appropriations and one-times and transfers, such that we would have spent about 8 million more than we were taking in current FY25 revenue. That's on line AE in the green column, that $8 million negative. And so we were thinking we would have 8.4. We were sort of deficiting 8, projected to end FY25 with just under $350,000, which felt like a comfortable buffer. Of course, times change. Now I'm in the purple column. The E-Board has met again. They met in July. They issued an updated revenue forecast, which updates all 3 of our major revenue streams. Once again, it's a slight increase. You can see there's an increase in the clean water surcharge. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second because there's sort of an asterisk there. The sheets are pretty stable. Those don't change much, and there has been an increase in the meals and rooms tax portion. So the 25.5 we were anticipating jumps up to 27.6, 27.7.8 more or less. So given that the appropriations are unchanged, that bottom line, what was going to be a negative $8 million, is now only a negative 5.8. That's on line AE of that purple column. And then combined with now, instead of 8.4 at the end of January, at the end of 2024, we have 11.8. So those combinations bring what was going to be a projected $350,000 ending balance at the end of FY25 up to about $6 million. So sort of marching forward, I won't spend a lot of time on the final green column. That was just our projections of FY26 revenue in January last time we met. Of course, those have been updated. There is also an upgrade there, 26.1 jumping up to 28.4 in total. This operating statement reflects the draft clean water budget that's elsewhere in the package, and we are in the meeting minutes today, and we will be talking about that in more detail. Booking, again, combining with proposed transfers to the agricultural clean water fund and other funds. It's the same familiar exercise, right, where we are proposing to spend more funding than we will take in revenues in FY26, essentially to eliminate that projected $6.028 million deficit, to wind up, allegedly, with nothing on the bottom line at the end of FY26. And then the final purple column is just kind of an FYI, like I said at the beginning, very difficult to estimate that far out, but just to give a sense where revenues may be headed in the long term, that gives FY27. So 2 quick things I'll flesh out, and then I'm happy to take any questions on the operating statement. I do want to point out, I mentioned jumping back over to FY24, there's a $100,000 entry on line C for reversions. That's somewhat unusual. Typically, we have not reverted from the Clean Water Fund. By way of explanation, those funds correspond to starting in, I think it was FY21. Somebody with more tenure can jump in if I'm wrong on that. But there is a piece of the Clean Water statute that describes a programmatic audit for the Clean Water Fund. That was something the legislature put in as part of the authorizing legislation that created the Clean Water Board and the Clean Water Fund. And for a number of fiscal years, the folks at the Agency of Natural Resources who sort of run this program, and others, I think at the Agency of Administration, put out to bid that service, asking, issuing an RFP looking for interest in auditing the program, and received no response for several years in a row. So there was a concerted effort. I think at one point the amount was bumped up, additional funds were added, and the scope may have been altered slightly. But essentially what that reversion represents is after, I think it's 3 or 4 years of trying and not finding, having any interest on that audit, it seemed like those funds could be, reprogrammed and put to better use elsewhere in the budget. And I'll defer to program staff on more detail there. And then the final little asterisk to talk about is if you scroll over, Gianna, to the purple FY25 column, or no, the FY26, I guess, is where it starts. Now I'm forgetting my effective dates, but basically there was a piece of a pretty significant piece of legislation that many people on this call will be familiar with, Act 181, which did a lot of things. It was a 200-something page bill that came out of the legislature this year and changed a lot having to do with what will now be the Land Use Review Board and kind of Act 250 modification and the way we look at development across the state. So it was a pretty sweeping bill. One part of that bill made some changes to the property transfer tax. And I won't get in too deeply into the weeds here in the interest of time. I'm happy to follow up with anybody who's curious about more detail. But basically, our methodology for projecting that top line revenue figure has always tied that projection to property transfer tax increases or decreases. We look at how that's going to go, and generally because it's levied on the same universe of property, it makes sense that this would change at the same rate. However, this year there is projected to be a precipitous increase in property transfer taxes per the legislative and administration's consensus revenue forecast. And that precipitous increase is driven, I think, primarily by changes to the property transfer tax statute per this large piece of legislation that passed, which will not, in fact, impact the Clean Water Fund surcharge revenue stream. That was relatively unchanged. So the upshot is, for the first time, we're proposing a slightly different projection methodology than past practice. And I think Emily and others wanted us to highlight that because that is a decision I think that the board should review and ultimately approve, rather than, if we were to follow the prior methodology, we would be projecting quite a bit more revenue than 8.5 in FY25 and 8.6 in FY26. And that seems pretty unlikely given the reality. So I got together with Secretary Moore and others and kind of put our best minds together with the folks in the tax department who helped me with these projections. And this is the figure we settled on based on a relatively conservative, but still optimistic relative to future year projections rate. So wanting to flag that for the board, and happy to answer any questions if there's more discussion about that. But as always, it's a lot of words for me. It's a lot of little boxes with numbers in them. I try my best to make it colorful at least, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions, or we can merrily move on. But thanks for your time.
Thank you, Nick. And in terms of process, we have been including the prior operating statement as a consent agenda item for approval in the next board meeting in terms of the action item that Nick had just outlined.
Emily, we have a question in the room. Jim.
So, Nicholas, do you have any information from the treasurer's office on the interest? Because the ending balance of 2023 was just under $13.5 million. To generate $2.5 million worth of interest, that's a 19% interest rate. I clearly understand cash comes into the state every day, cash goes out of the state every day, but that seems like an extraordinarily high number. And we also raised $1.5 million in interest the year before. So I guess behind that question is maybe understanding more how the treasurer's office is looking at that, whether we should be booking some interest revenue for the coming year.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Jim. And I think it's an astute observation. I always love people picking these things out. So one starting distinction that I think is important is that ending balance of 13 point whatever, if we're scrolling slightly down, that is not actually the fund balance. That is the amount of prior year. It's confusing, I realize, based on the wording. That is the amount of unobligated spending authority with respect to the fund. So this operating statement is a appropriations basis document, which is different than a revenue and expenditure. This is getting a little bit into accounting, but I know given your background, you're probably familiar with this. This is showing basically how much are we appropriating, how much are we authorizing to spend against, projected revenue, which is a slightly different concept from, okay, how much money, how much cash actually is in the fund. So this is set that line on AG, the 13.4 million, is just saying, okay, based on all of the prior year authorizations and based on all of the revenue booked, that much was not obligated, right? So you can think about that as sort of free, undesignated money, right? The actual fund balance is not reflected in this document. That, as you mentioned, right, varies a lot day to day, month to month, depending on the workflow and timing. It's safe to say that the fund balance is considerably higher than that number. I don't have immediately at my fingertips what it is, but I think it's in the tens of millions of dollars higher. The reason, again, being that not only is there the cash flow and timing issues within a fiscal year, but because we generally do not revert clean water spending authority, there has been, particularly as agencies work to get a lot of federal funding out the door, there've been this massive increase in ARPA and IIJA and these sort of one-time federal influxes that are very time sensitive. There has been a bit of, I think, a buildup of prior year authorized spending authority in the Clean Water Fund, which just means that those funds sit a little bit longer than they would have and allows that fund balance to grow. So to your question, no, I don't believe the state of Vermont is booking a 19% interest rate. That would be great if I could invest in the state. That would be the way to go. It has been high for sure. It's been higher than prior years, but I believe it's still in the single digits. And I'd certainly be happy to either put you in touch with or follow up with folks at the treasurer's office to get precisely what the rate is. But good question.
Yeah, right. So I understand all that, Nicholas. I understand your explanation. So why would one believe at the end of this year, all the money that has been obligated would pretty much be spent and not just be carrying the appropriations over year to year? So I think there would continue to be some significant interest available for the following year's spending. Certainly not $2.5 million. We're spending more than we're taking in. But I think there should be a number that we should include. We have a $2.5 million reserve for a variety of things, but I think it would be prudent to add some more money to the spending plan.
I hear you, Jim. I'll respond quickly and then welcome commentary from others. I think it's a fair point. You can look at the last two fiscal years and, like you said, note that there's been pretty significant interest booked. As I mentioned, historically, that has not been the case. So it's certainly I think a topic for discussion for the board. What if any amount that would be a reasonable assumption. I think the hope, of course, is that these projects continue moving and that the funding does get out the door. In some sense, I think, statewide, we are hoping that this phenomenon, which is not unique to the Clean Water Fund, but just with this massive influx of federal funding, may be a bit of a time-limited thing. So as we return to a kind of business as usual scenario, I think the hope is that the funds get out the door quicker. But I'll defer, of course, to Secretary Moore and Emily and others about programmatic details. I think it's certainly a discussion item the board can choose to pursue.
Yeah, I would say, Jim, that it's definitely worth going through a formal discussion on it because the consensus forecast process for the state as a whole, for the first time, included an interest amount in, because the first year a significant interest amount joined the state's revenues. It was kind of a surprise, and then they did incorporate an interest section. I think the one thing that the board does also have to talk through in the long run, and I know we're getting a little bit over on this section of the agenda, but is we've been maintaining program spending according to available revenues, but we haven't necessarily been doing any inflation adjustments to our recommended budgets. And so I think that's something we have to talk through as well, that I think original language around the formation of the board talks about maintenance of effort and applying inflation, and that's not necessarily a level of weeds that we've dove into at this point. So I think it's worth talking about the interest and when that might start to taper as the Fed has started to scale down their anti-inflation measures. But you're correct that there will be an interest amount for FY25. It will be in the low millions, and there will very likely be an interest amount for FY26 that we should consider accounting for. And I think Emily, we can make sure, I don't know if we want to try to earmark that for the next section, or if we just flow into that.
Sure. Yeah, one possibility is we could look at a conservative budget target or revenue target for interest income and consider adding that to what is proposed as one-time funds as a conservative approach. That would be maybe one way to go about it as a suggestion.
Yeah, I have some other thoughts related to this that I wanted to talk through during the budget session, section.
Great.
So.
Yeah, that sounds great. I see that Chad has his hand raised as well. And then maybe we
Yeah,
can move
thank
into
you.
that.
Just having no accounting background whatsoever, I just like to look at that figure. And I know interest accrues over time, and maybe this could be as you say, a separate discussion, but maybe we should be waiting to allocate these funds as late as we can, if we can take advantage of that. Maybe it's a mechanics or a practice issue as well. But it's nice to hear you guys chat about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Should we move into the presentation of the proposed budget?
Sure. So
Great.
I'll try to run through this relatively briefly. I can see we're over time. This is not in the meeting materials, but it is on the site page that Emily has linked in the chat. It's the presentation slides for those who would like to follow along. This will be sort of a reminder of how the budget is built for folks and how the draft budget is proposed to the board. Next slide, please. There's typically 4 steps: setting the budget targets, estimating the base need, and then assigning either Clean Water Fund or capital bill dollars to those needs, identifying those short-term influxes and appropriate uses for that, and then verifying that this budget distribution aligns with statutory priorities. So starting with budget targets, you heard a lot from Nick Kramer about the Clean Water Fund, and I'll talk a little bit also about the capital bill dollars. And they're usually shown at the very bottom of the budget sheets in the prior slides. That's where you'd see what we're projecting to come in. That's how the operating statement translates over to the budget sheet. Thank you. Next slide. So talking about the 2 major pieces that feed into the budget, the capital dollars over on the left here, we typically rely on $10 to $12 million contribution from the clean water section of the capital bill. The capital bill is done every other year in the legislature. So, and every other year, the board either already knows or conservatively estimates that the contribution will be $10 million or knows it's roughly in that range. And so that's used as a budget target for the capital bill dollars. And then over on the right is the Clean Water Fund dollars. And Nick just ran through the operating statement for that. So that's the process by which we get more clear revenue projections for what might be coming in for state fiscal year 2026. And we build a budget to be spending and allocating dollars the same year that those revenues are coming in. So I won't talk more about that. We got a good overview from Nick there. So next slide. So now we talk about estimating the base need and assigning these funds. So essentially, we rely on the interagency work group to talk about what the needs are and to understand what the base, what each program needs based on need and demand. So the green section shows the base funding. And then next slide, please. And then the budget totals for both columns, both capital and clean water fund, are trying to reflect the core program needs for each line item and allow for some steady growth in pace with both the capacity of the program and our external partners, as well as the demand for that line item. And they also, as a base, provide that long-term non-federal match to long-term federal funding initiatives. So essentially, we're trying to set up base funding so that the budget for these line items does not change too drastically year to year. And then base funds are split between Clean Water Fund dollars and capital bill dollars based on the strategy under item 2 on this slide. It's a longstanding strategy that the board has followed, which is trying to maximize capital bill dollars towards those capital eligible activities and reserve Clean Water Fund, which is more flexible, towards non-capital eligible activities, to try and limit capital bill to as few line items as possible, and then to reserve Clean Water Fund dollars for those higher statutory priorities, higher up tier 1 and tier 2 in the budget. And we'll show how that trickles out for this year's budget in just a minute. You've heard a little bit today of this unallocated, unreserved section of the operating statement, the $6 million. So it does happen that the board sees these short-term influxes of funding. For example, in state fiscal year 22 to 24, we actually categorize the American Rescue Plan Act dollars also as one-time funds. And more recently, as you heard today, we received some fund interest, and so we've been categorizing that as one-time funds. And Nick explained really well how unallocated, unreserved tends to materialize. Often when a prior fiscal year closes under budget, we've got this money we didn't expect to have. Or if the revenue projections for the current fiscal year are higher than when the current fiscal year's budget was developed, we have this other money that hasn't been assigned anywhere. So both the prior fiscal year's closeout and the current fiscal year's sort of boost all gets bundled and rolled forward as one time that we're budgeting into state fiscal year 2026. We assign this money, the strategy of assigning the one-time funds tries to look at filling discrete short-term gaps. For example, if there's short-term federal money that needs a non-federal match, that's a really good use of these funds. Maybe replenishing as needed line items or boosting line items. So one year the board used one-time funds to boost the contingency reserve up to the $2.5 million, as well as replenishing the innovative and alternative technologies or practices line item. Next slide. And then the last piece is really verifying, okay, we've got this draft budget. Is it reflecting the priorities set in statute? So these 4 sections of the budget sheet kind of sum total by funding source, by tier, how much money and the percent of the money. So the board, and so next slide, please. The Clean Water Board does separate funding into these tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and other. So higher priority items are tier 1 and lower priority are tier 3 and other. And statute is what determines for the board which programs are first, second, third tier under 10 VSA 1389E. So our understanding of the intent of this from the legislature was to prioritize first programs and opportunities that are voluntarily driven, recognizing that these would need sort of additional incentive or cost coverage to be implemented. Second tier programs often have the flavor of supporting regulatory compliance, but on public lands and with public infrastructure, recognizing that largely those will be driven by regulation, but also seeking to offset those public costs since there's a lot of people paying into those public costs. And then third priority seeks to offset regulatory compliance costs for private entities. There are some exemptions across these line items, but that's the general flavor of those tiers. And then other are programs that were not specifically listed in 10 VSA 1389E, but they are included in the budget because they support either different statutory priorities like lake and crisis, or to leverage other federal funding opportunities for clean water. So as a final check on the draft budget, the board considers what proportion of the funds have been distributed across those tiers. And as a best practice, the board tries to aim for at least 60% into tier 1, 30% into tier 2, 10% into tier 3 and other, but this does vary year to year based on need and whether external funding opportunities are supporting some of the line items in this budget. Next slide, please. So now just at a glance, what does state fiscal year 26 look like? It's roughly $44.5 million total. That's the budget target. And there's these different funding sources I just talked about. The $28.5 million is the projected new revenue coming into the Clean Water Fund during state fiscal year 2026. And that's what the operating statement that Nick was presenting on. Next up, we have the $10 million from the clean water section of the state's capital bill that's proposed to be allocated through the clean water budget process. And then finally, we have this roughly $6 million in prior and current year unallocated unreserved revenues that we're proposing in the draft to serve as one-time funds. Next slide. These pie charts are in the all the materials for you as well, but this gives you the snapshot of how the money does get distributed across the tiers. So over on the left, that's the full budget and how it's distributed across the priority tiers. You can see even more than 60%, 70% is going towards tier 1 this year, 18% towards tier 2, 3% in tier 3, and 9% towards other. But again, given our strategy to preferentially spend Clean Water Fund in the higher priority tiers, that's the two pie charts in the right kind of break it down by the Clean Water Fund dollars and the capital bill dollars. So on the top one, you can see the majority of Clean Water Fund, even 75% of that is heavily invested into tier 1. And then the majority of the remainder, 20% is going into tier 2. Conversely, over on the capital bill side, almost 40% of it is falling into the other category, and about 50% is going into tier 1. And to wrap up, what does this look like compared to prior fiscal years? The state fiscal year 2026 full budget is all the way on the right of this slide. The y-axis is the total budget size. The x-axis is the budgeted fiscal year. The solid teal is the Clean Water Fund. The hashed mark or striped teal is the one-time funds. The yellow solid is the capital bill money, and then the red or dark orange striped is the American Rescue Plan Act dollars for state fiscal years 22 through 24. So you can see over in 2026, it's about a $4.5 million increase from state fiscal year 2025's budget and a $7.5 million increase from what we thought this year's budget was going to look like this time last year. So it's a huge increase. And our colleague Nick really explained some of those big changes, boosting both the solid teal and the striped teal and the interest income. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gianna. I'm going to switch back over to the meeting materials now and give a quick overview of the policy document that we have as the narrative to support the proposed budget for this year. And then I'm going to highlight a few changes that are new this year compared to last year for the board's awareness. So I'm scrolling down. This is the policy document. In prior years, we had labeled this as the budget overview, and it's a narrative that really helps to explain the scope and purpose of the budget recommendation. In the past, we tried to have the budget narrative be an educational resource and a policy resource. And so this year, what we've done is we've really tried to focus this narrative on the policy and the technical components of the budget. And we have some other excellent educational materials that have been developed by Gianna and Colleen to support the public's understanding of the budget, the story map, and a plain language budget table, which you'll hear more about later. So this document is really focused on serving as a technical policy document to explain the scope and purpose of the budget. And I just wanted to highlight that the intent is that it provides transparency on the intent of the board's budget recommendation, and it supports agencies in being able to implement programs in a manner that's consistent with the board's recommendation as it was presented to the public. So within this document, we have a budget at a glance. We have the screenshot of the budget recommendation sheet. We have a summary of the budget drafting approach that Gianna just walked you through in her slides. And we also have the line item descriptions for each line item organized by agency in this document. So that's there. Now I'm going to scroll down to the budget sheet and zoom in a little bit. Actually, I'm going to switch over to the spreadsheet so it's a little bit easier for folks to follow along. And I'm basically just going to walk you through the budget sheet so we can talk about what some highlights for this year. Geez, I'm just rearranging my screens for a moment. Okay. Make this a little bit bigger for everybody to see. And so for the most part, the base columns of the budget are fairly consistent with prior years, and that is part of the strategy, that there's consistency and continuity there for program stability. But I did want to highlight a few things for the base funds this year. We do have an increase to the Agency of Ag's line item, water quality grants to partners and farmers. This is an increase compared to prior years, but is fairly well in line with the base funding levels that the Ag Agency has received for this line item over the last few years. So that's a slight increase there. We also have some modest increases to some of the line items for the Ag Agency and Agency of Natural Resources program support, as well as the Forest Parks and Rec line items, acknowledging that there have been some cost rates associated with personnel that are supported by these line items across the board, and wanting to be supportive of meeting the full need there. I'll also just note that if you scroll down, you'll see that this year the Clean Water State Revolving Fund federal grant state match is at 0. And the reason for this is that we have enough prior year funds to support the match needed in this fiscal year. So for this 1 year, we have slightly increased the amount going into the municipal pollution control grants that are administered in tandem with the Clean Water State Revolving Fund from $3.3 million to $4 million. And just wanted to note, and there's a footnote on the budget sheet, that next year, this line item for the state match to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund will need to be repopulated, but we do have a one-time pause on this. I'll also just flag that up above under program and partner support, we've heard a lot of interest and feedback on the need for continuing to support organizational capacity to develop the clean water workforce, and this line item continues to support funding for that. So those are just a few highlights on the base funding side of things. What's mostly new and unique this year falls under the one-time funds, and that's part of the strategy of how one-time funds are programmed to fill short-term discrete gaps and to support leveraging and opportunities for leveraging. So I'm going to switch gears and give some quick highlights on what's included in the one-time funds for your awareness. For the Agency of Agriculture water quality grants to partners and farmers, we have an additional $2 million proposed for one-time funds to support leveraging of Federal Inflation Reduction Act dollars. This helps the farmers to meet the cost share requirements and hopefully break down barriers to being able to leverage those federal investments. So we have $2 million proposed there. Moving down to program and partner support, we have about $500,000 that's proposed to support flood and extreme weather related needs for clean water project repair and organizational capacity related to flood recovery as well. Moving down into tier 2, we have a boost to the Department of Forest Parks and Rec line item to implement best management practices at state forests, parks, and recreational access points. This is reflecting that there's been quite a bit of capacity building that's happened with this initiative, and there's additional demand for project work here. And so this is attempting to help fill part of that gap and support this program. getting projects out on the ground. Moving down, we have VTrans Better Roads program, and we have $750K proposed here to fill the remaining funding gap to support municipalities in doing road erosion inventory reassessments that are required every 5 years under the municipal roads general permit. So this, combined with one-time funds from last year, fully meet the funding need for that. And then moving down, these next two one-time uses are all sort of explained together, but first we have $1.2 million proposed under the innovation line item in tier 2. Roughly 200,000 of this we are proposing to support covering the remaining funding gap for the Lake Carmi alum treatment implementation. That's the funding gap that we anticipate will remain after the Clean Water State Revolving Fund loan for that alum treatment is leveraged, and some of the one-time funds from last year's clean water budget are leveraged. So we'd like to fully support the remaining gap that's anticipated for the alum treatment, pending the permitting and feasibility work that's ongoing for that project. The remaining $1 million roughly out of this line item is proposed to develop a financing structure that is going to support tier 2 regulatory requirements, mainly municipal 3-acre general permit sites and logging equipment to support implementation of the acceptable management practices for water quality on logging jobs. So the idea is that we would develop a multi-use financing structure that would be deposited with a bank that can be used to make loans for eligible uses. And then the repayment of those loans would revolve back into that fund and continue to be available to support financing of these activities. Part of the strategy there is that we'd be using one-time funds as seed funds to set up this new financing structure, but then longer term, it would reduce the budget pressures on the clean water budget by having a financing mechanism available to support that. And similar to that, under tier 3 here, we propose $1.3 million for the developed lands implementation grants. And that would also feed into this multi-use financing mechanism that would be available to support private non-municipal 3-acre sites in complying with the 3-acre general permit. And similarly, it would be deposited into an account that would be lent out by a financial institution, a bank, to these entities. And then the repayment of those loans would be revolved back into that fund to continue to provide that financial support. And this is really good timing because we have just finished allocating American Rescue Plan Act or ARPA dollars to support the 3-acre permit body of work. There's been about $30 million put out into the system thanks to the one-time funds we had through ARPA. And now that those dollars are all awarded and we've passed the deadline for being able to award those dollars, this would be the next available financial assistance to support the 3-acre body of work, which is a pretty critical component of being able to implement the Lake Champlain Restoration Plan. So this is what we're proposing to initiate that financing structure, and the demand is anticipated to be pretty significant for this body of work. So that is the overview of what's new for this year's budget compared to prior years. And now apologies, we're a little bit behind schedule, but I believe we'll be shifting gears to the discussion and proposed action on the clean water budget with the Clean Water Board. So Chair Farnham, I'll hand it back over to you to tee that up.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
And yeah, apologies. It looks like we ran the agenda a little bit tight this time. I think there's 1 or 2 items here that I'll mention, but we might not have time for full discussion, and we can try to make sure we add a little bit into our next session, or depending on how this portion of the discussion goes, possibly schedule another board meeting. So the first item we had under the discussion section is if anyone has any further questions on the financing concept that Emily just went over related to stormwater and forestry regulatory compliance. I would just add that we did get significant feedback from legislators during the last legislative session that they were particularly interested in seeing something related to supporting forestry compliance. And that's, I think, one reason that we've tried to create a seed fund in this area is based on that legislative feedback, which seems wise given we propose, but then they actually vote and approve a budget. So, so just wondering, throwing that one out there, if any board members have any questions or comments on that section. Jim?
So did I correctly understand there's $1 million dedicated to create a loan fund?
There's overall across the two line items in tier 2 and tier 3, there's $2.3 million that would be allocated to establish a loan fund for tier 2, the logging regulations and municipal 3-acre sites, and in tier 3, the private 3-acre sites.
Right. So my experience with loan funds is it's usually not the lack of access to capital. It's the lack of ability to pay for the loan. So I would have some concerns about creating a loan fund without knowing that people actually have the ability to pay for that.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying, Jim, that the people that are going to try and get this money really don't have the ability to get the money.
If you're a bank and looking at their balance sheet, you're not going to loan them the money unless you're going to look at writing it off. So over my years at the Agency of Human Services, I've looked at a variety of loan funds. We established one for persons with disabilities to buy equipment, but usually the issue is they don't have the ability to pay for it.
Bob, I see your hand is raised. Are you responding to that? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my clarifying question perhaps in response to the conversation is it also depends. You know, what's the term, what's the rate? You know, someone can pay back a 0% interest loan over 20, 30 years as opposed to a 5% loan over 5 years. I mean, so without knowing that, I'm not exactly sure how to think about it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'll welcome Neil also jumping in on this, but the idea is that by the state setting up this financing structure, it could be advantageous interest rates that are lower than a traditional lending environment. And then there's also some mechanisms, I believe, where the Clean Water State Revolving Fund could underwrite the loan so that there is less of a concern about the banks being willing to take that on. And that has been a concept that's been long under development related to financial support related to supporting the 3-acre permit body of work. And so, Neil, I don't know if you want to jump in and share anything further on that. And then I see we also have Oliver from Forest Parks and Rec here to speak to the logging financing piece of it.
Sure. Thank you, Emily. I mean, you described it fairly well. Jim, this concept initially developed out of developing a financing mechanism for 3-acre private entities using the state's Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And the way that would work is we would put a deposit out of the fund into a bank requiring some nominal interest earning on that deposit. So it decentralizes that deposit. And then allow the bank to, lend off of it at a delta, and their earnings would be that delta, with the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund, as Emily said, providing the underwriting. So this concept here, we're seeing a tremendous amount of demand on the SRFs municipally, like all of a sudden with the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So seeing the interest coming to the General Assembly around 3-acre, and also what Oliver will speak about, this seemed like an opportunity to give it a try, if you will, with Clean Water Fund dollars. So that's what I would add to Emily's already solid explanation.
Yeah, and
Oh,
go ahead.
go ahead,
Emily,
Oliver.
thanks. Yeah, I'm Oliver Pearson. I'm the director for forests and FPR. To speak to the forestry regulatory compliance piece of this potential loan fund, what we're trying to achieve here is help logging contractors and businesses in Vermont get access to capital to obtain equipment that has a lower impact on forest soils, but is at a cost that is prohibitive for them to either purchase with full payment up front or at a higher interest rate that they might get from a commercial bank loan. This idea comes from Maine, where there's a similar program using Clean Water State revolving funds that's had very high demand and been very successful in getting sort of lower impact logging equipment out to loggers to comply with their clean water requirements, and then help loggers increase efficiency and reduce discharges and other negative impacts in the woods. And as has been said, logging contractors in Vermont have struggled with a reduced operating season because of wet summers and warm winters, impacts of climate change, and have been very interested in obtaining some support from state or other partners to help them to increase their operating season through use of this equipment. When we talked about the sort of the ability of these logging contractors to exactly what was raised here to be able to repay these loans, what kind of collateral would they be able to provide? What we learned in talking to professional logging contractors of the Northeast, which represents loggers in Vermont, as well as the Vermont Forest Products Association, is that there are loggers that are already successfully a few getting loans at much higher and much more disadvantageous interest rates, but the majority are sort of on standby for some program with lower interest rates to come along and would have the necessary collateral to secure a bank loan under the terms of this program and be able to pay it back with the revenue stream that they'd be projecting. So we've done a bit of due diligence here. We've also there's a number of banks that are operating in both Maine and Vermont, and what those banks have, the Vermont banks have said from their partners in Maine is that the program in Maine has been a very successful one, and they have some level of comfort in trying to set something up, given their knowledge of logging sector in Vermont. So I think it's a great question, but the research we've done so far suggests that there's both interest in this program from logging contractors and the ability to repay loans, assuming that they're at, as Neil said, a slightly better interest rate than what is commercially offered by lending banks today.
One thing I would add, Jim, is that it's a good point, and I would say one of the most critical things when considering a revolving loan structure is the recipient, the audience that you're trying to reach. And I've seen revolving loan structures be very successful in economic development for businesses and for municipalities, but they generally, when it's targeted individuals, especially vulnerable individuals, they generally become forgivable loan programs.
Right.
And they don't really function in that sector. So I think if we were talking about a program that served private landowners, like individuals that weren't running a business and didn't have a business plan, that would be much, much higher risk if we were trying to do something like that. Right, back to you, Emily.
Yeah, so I see Chad has his hand up too. I'll just respond to that. I think it should be noted that the 3-acre general permit, the entities that need to be covered under that permit, there's a whole range of different types of sites, some commercial businesses, some are private residential that are co-permitted with municipalities. And so I think that there would be a desire to look at the different types of entities and the ability to pay, affordability criteria, and think about how we can design a financing structure that may be supportive of those different situations. And you mentioned loan forgiveness. In some cases, there may be ability to leverage some of that, but that is certainly going to need to be part of the program design that we would need to be working on as part of the launch of this new financing structure.
Yeah, I'm speaking to that, Emily. As from what I understand with the 3-acre permit, the funding that's available now, if you apply for it, covers permitting costs only, no implementation. Is that going to remain the same?
Right now, we do have some funding available, grant and contract funding available for implementation targeting manufactured housing communities as well as public schools, and some public-private partnerships between municipal and private entities with the American Rescue Plan Act dollars. So the idea is that this financing structure would be able to support probably some permit obtainment if folks are behind on getting their permits, although they should be further along at this stage, but then also to support the costs of construction in order to comply with the permit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I don't know about the other members of the board, but I unfortunately do have a hard stop today at 10:30. So I do want to make sure we leave enough time for public comment, and hopefully we can get to a place of comfort to recommend for the board to recommend to post the draft version so we can start receiving that public comment, and maybe from a place of, we know we have a lot more ground to cover at the next meeting, and maybe we schedule more time at the next meeting, but we'd want to get something up there that the public can begin to respond to, and create a bit more space for. The next item I had requested to be placed on the agenda, we're going to, I think, to have to defer this topic to the next meeting. But would generally like the board members to start to think about, whether or not the board would like to develop guiding principles for cost share of programs that are deploying the money, right? I think this was a good discussion about, the viability of a structure, the pros and cons of a structure, and particularly like the bit that Emily mentioned about, and I use the word forgiveness, and it's like, okay, well, we might have affordability, we might have some landowners that need more assistance than others or need more forgiveness. How would the board like to approach that at a very high level potentially and inform the agencies and departments that we're supporting through the budget process? One, just FYI, I wanted to mention during this that I won't have time to dig into a lot, but the positive effect of the high interest rates is that we may end up seeing this on our operating statement. The negative effect of high interest rates is that the CDAC, the committee that does debt affordability for the state as a whole, is reducing their capital bill borrowing recommendations for the state because of those high interest rates. So we earn more money for capital we have, but capital is also more expensive to procure. So that is going to be a pressure that the board feels. I personally feel like we should continue to push for the $10 million in the capital bill to sustain that capital bill presence. But I think the board should be aware that the capital bill process at large is going to be under increasing pressure. Now, the reduction of interest rates might help with that, but that was a most recent adjustment, and that takes time to flow through the financial channels and actually really significantly change the cost of capital. So to adding one point in here before we try to move towards any type of approval motion, I think with the interest inclusion, I'd be interested to see how the board members feel about that, if we're able to talk about that quickly. But I think one path might be to ask for DFM to recommend Department of Finance and Management, to Department of Finance and Management, aka Nick Kramer, to recommend an inclusion or adjustment to the operating statement to account for interest income in FY25 and 26, and a process overview as to how that would be calculated or estimated. Not necessarily to be added for the draft version, but maybe, I don't know if we could highlight this row as under consideration when we post the draft version or not. But that might be one way to account for the uncertainty and the potential to adjust the budget in that area based on impacts it might have to the operating statement. There's a lot, sorry, little circular there. Any board member reactions to that suggestion? If people like it, then a draft or a motion to make that request.
Doug, I
So
would
moved.
move that we make the request.
Second.
Do I have a second?
Anson, second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. No nays, the ayes have it. So we will make that formal request for the next board meeting. Is that satisfactory, Jim?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
When is our next board meeting? Because I'm wondering whether we need an interim one, because I would like to hear sort of a high level thoughts as how this loan program would work and who the audience would be, whether we're doing forgiveness, what exactly is being, I'm not looking for details fleshed out,
Right.
but just more of an
More meat on
outline.
the bones.
Yeah.
More time to talk it through. I think that's prudent. Our next hearing would be, our public hearing would be is scheduled tentatively for November 8th right now, or I don't know if that's tentative or formally scheduled at this point.
It's
Okay.
formally scheduled. Yep.
Okay.
And then we have December 3rd board meeting to review the public comment.
Okay. So
Is-
public
Doug-
comment will still be being compiled. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Doug, sorry, it's Bob. Is it, because I share Jim's desire, and I get time, and I know it's not going to happen, but it'd be nice to have had the opportunity to comment and ask questions on what we've just been presented, which we obviously are not going to have today. So is there a way to build in a half-hour board meeting that piggybacks with the public hearing, for what it's worth?
Yes, absolutely. We could either do a piggyback structure, which I think probably makes the most sense for my scheduling and everything like that, would be to piggyback. So we can plan to do that.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
So I will extend that calendar invite for the public hearing by 30 minutes to allow for that time. Does that work with folks' schedule?
Well, I don't think it was a public comment time. I think it was time for the board to discuss it after the public comment time.
Yep.
Okay.
Right. Do we feel like 30 minutes will be sufficient?
No.
All right.
I just don't.
Right.
I just don't think.
I think, let's see if we can add an hour. We'll see if that is possible. And plan for a fairly substantive meeting on the 8th. If we start to get too substantive, then yes, we may need to break up the two things, but I do want to make sure we have room for sufficient board discussion in this cycle.
Okay, thank you.
And I know I'm coming up close on the public comment time required. The next item I mentioned earlier, the inflation adjustment. And the history there, the context there, from when the board was initially created. I know Secretary Moore is much more familiar with this than I am. But hopefully, I think we can place that as a discussion item in that additional session. I think it does play into kind of the maintenance of effort and the intended budget levels. So we'll place that on the agenda next time. So at this point, I'd like to move on to approval of the draft recommendation to post. But I want to be respectful here. I think we've tried to make space for discussion. I think we've got some ground to cover in November. Are the board members comfortable considering that motion? So leave it open for a moment to see if anyone really isn't comfortable with that draft going up at this point.
No, I'm good, Doug, and I'll make that motion.
All right. All right. Thank you, Bob. All right. Thank you, Chad. All opposed, say aye. I'm sorry. All in favor, say aye. Too fast.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. So we will post the draft FY26 clean water budget for public comment. Now I'm going to move to the public comment section of the agenda. Emily?
Thank
would
you.
Please?
We have folks who RSVP'd ahead of time to comment. First up is Sylvia Knight, and I believe that she got in touch that she was going to send in written comment because she was unable to attend, but just checking real quick to see. Yeah, I don't believe that she is here. So we will move on next to Ernest Engelhardt. They're in the conference room. Hello.
Good morning. I'll keep my comments pretty short. Basically, I have two. The first one is to thank the Clean Water Board for the massive job that you folks have. I can't imagine how complicated it is and everything that you must have to go through. But we really, really appreciate the support that you've given us for Lake Carmine. It's wonderful. It gives us hope that this lake can get cleaned up. Secondly, we're cautiously optimistic that the alum treatment will do what it's supposed to be doing, and we hope that it is done as quickly as it can reasonably be done. This late October, we were at camp a few days, and the lake continues to be really poor. Expedition and expediency as much as possible to do that. But again, thank the board for your support for us.
Thank you for your comment. Next up is Brian Maher, but I don't believe that he is in attendance. I'm checking the list. Nope. So I'll move on to Peter Benevento.
Yeah, hi, Pete Benevento here from Lake Carmine, and I'd just like to reiterate Ernie's comments and thank the Clean Water Board for all your help for us here at Lake Carmine. As Ernie said, we did have a difficult summer again, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. We are in the process of finalizing an engineering services agreement with a contractor to do the alum treatment. So again, we are seeing this light at the end of the tunnel, and it wouldn't be possible without your support at the Clean Water Board. So again, thank you very much for your support, and we look forward to working with you into the future. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Last up on the list of folks who signed up is Jean Sutton. But again, unfortunately, I don't believe that they are in attendance. Apologies. Okay. So I believe that covers everybody who signed up ahead of time to comment, but I'll give a moment in case there's any other public attendees that wish to comment. You may raise your hand with the raise hand function or simply unmute if you are unable to navigate to the raise hand function.
We have Jared in the room, Emily.
Oh, hi, Jared. Would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Doug. With Jared Carpenter with the Lake Champlain Committee. On behalf of the advocate community, I want to thank the board for, I'm sorry, looking at my notes here. I want to thank the board for the level funding of the restoration grants, and especially the $5 million for the enhancement grants. These are really important statewide money to go into various clean water projects and programs. The partner support increase of $425,000 is fabulous. This goes to the conservation districts and the watershed groups that do these projects on the ground that help with water quality. We've been pushing for more partner support for a long time. This will help them, expand their number of employees and all sorts of, the capacity to do these projects and programs. So that's fantastic. A little bit of concern with with not including money for the SRF for this year. I know that the state has gotten a bunch through the last couple of years and future years through IIJA/bill. But if it's available, should we keep drawing down federal money just to have it? Because it's obviously a great thing to have, even though we already have a fair, I don't know the amounts, but my understanding is we do have a fair amount. And will this somehow as far as the feds are concerned, preclude us from drawing down money in the future? Probably not, but it seems something that we should just sort of keep doing. And finally, very intrigued by this loan program, the 3-acre loan program. We've been hearing, the advocates have been hearing from legislators and others concerns with the costs, not only permitting, but construction. And we've gotten right into the thick of the beginning of that permitting program. So intrigued as to how the loan program is going to work and whether or not there's other ways to bolster it from outside the Clean Water Fund. But no, thank you so much for the time to comment, and thank you for all the great work.
Thank you for your comment, Jared. Any other folks that wish to comment? I see Kathy Erfer has her hand raised. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hey, thank you, everyone, and thank you for everyone's effort on this. I would love to see a breakdown of the budget based on the 4 large watersheds with a clear allocation of which line items are going exactly to either the Connecticut River, Lake Champlain, Hudson, or Lake Memphremagog Basin, just to be very transparent about where the money is being spent across the state.
Thank you, Kathy. The new plain language budget table has a column that highlights the geographic scope of each line item. And so that may address your question, but I'd be happy to follow up with you offline if you have further questions after taking a look at that. And I can send you a link to that.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I believe that concludes public comment.
Looks like we got one more, Emily.
Oh, my apologies. Oh, Eric. Eric Blatt.
Yeah, is it okay to respond to Jared's concern about the match to the SRF?
I thought that's where you were piping in.
Yeah, we're not foregoing any federal dollars. We actually have some excess match dollars from the current state fiscal year 25 appropriation. What happened is the federal grants that we were anticipating receiving came out much lower, and as a result of that, we have excess match. So,
okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Thank you. The next agenda item was related to the communications plan, and I know we don't have time to cover that right now, so I'll work with the team to send out an email update to the Clean Water Board to give an overview of that content, if that would suffice.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, so to move into wrap up, again, I apologize to the board members for not leaving sufficient time for discussion, but we will be adding we'll definitely be adding something, probably we'll try to add an hour. Members can let us know if that additional hour on the end of the public hearing on November 8th ends up being problematic, and we'll work the schedule from here to make sure we have that discussion time. But I think we have a couple of good areas to talk through. There's a report available for review, the report on federal funding related to water quality improvements. The link is in your agenda. And then for awareness, just the public comment period will go from October 18th to November 17th. So we will not have compiled public comment at our hearing, right? Because it'll still be open, it'll still be coming in. But we'll have that hearing, and then we'll have another meeting on December 3rd, which we can use part of that 1 hour discussion to determine, how robust the agenda should be for our December 3rd meeting, where we will be considering, the sum of public comment, the results of the hearing, and our discussion on the 8th. So thank you, everybody. This concludes what day is it even? October 11th, 2024 Clean Water Board. And again, apologies to the board members for not leaving enough space, but hopefully we can counterbalance that in the next couple of meetings and really get to a good place of understanding. Hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Is anyone going to respond to Mr.